The cease and desist order was delivered by a pimply teenager on a silent electric golf cart, a reluctant foot soldier in the HOA's relentless war on common sense and history. I was sitting on the edge of my dock, a simple weathered structure of pine and cedar that smelled of lake water and 50 years of sunshine. The afternoon was quiet, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the pilings, and the satisfying thwack of my filleting knife against the cleaning board. I was in the middle of processing a handsome 5-pound largemouth bass I'd just pulled from the cool, clear waters of my lake. The boy handed me the crisp, cream-colored envelope with an apologetic shrug, as if to say, "Don't shoot the messenger." Inside, a single sheet of heavy bond paper, embossed with a garish golden swan logo, announced in a font that screamed self-importance that I, Thomas Grayson, was hereby ordered to cease and desist all unauthorized angling activities on Lake Asteria as per the newly ratified Bylaw 117 of the Asteria Lakes Homeowners Association. I looked from the imperious, threatening letter to the shimmering blue-green expanse of the lake that stretched out before me, then back to the letter. It was the most profoundly stupid, legally baseless document I had ever held in my hands. The Asteria Lakes HOA was trying to ban me from fishing on Lake Asteria, a lake my great-grandfather had literally carved out of the earth with mules and dynamite in 1928. A lake whose water rights, subterranean bed, and entire shoreline I legally and indisputably owned. This wasn't just a bureaucratic overreach. It was an attempt to legislate the very laws of reality. The paper decreed declaring the sky was now plaid and gravity was optional. My family had owned this land for over a century. We were farmers, conservationists, people who understood the rhythms of the earth, the sanctity of water, and the unyielding truth of a properly recorded deed. My great-grandfather, a man with more foresight than money, had dammed a creek that ran through his sprawling farm to create the 50-acre Lake Asteria, a private reservoir to irrigate his crops during the dry Georgia summers. In the 1990s, with farming becoming untenable, my father had sold off the surrounding 900 acres of rolling pasture land to a slick development corporation. But, on the advice of a very wise, very old lawyer, he had structured the deal with the precision of a surgeon. He sold them the land, but he kept the heart. The sale explicitly excluded the lake itself. The deed, a document I knew by heart, granted me his sole heir. A fee-simple title to the entirety of Parcel A, the body of water known as Lake Asteria, subterranean bed and all literal and riparian rights pertaining thereto, extending 50 feet from the high water mark in all directions. The developers of the Asteria Lakes community had built their multi-million-dollar homes around my lake. They had sold a lifestyle, a dream of waterfront living, using my water as their primary marketing tool. For years, a quiet, unspoken agreement had existed between my family and the residents. They could swim, boat, and enjoy the view. In return, they were expected to be respectful stewards of the resource. It was a fragile peace, built on courtesy and a mutual love for the lake. That peace ended the day Meredith Vance was elected HOA president. Meredith was a recent transplant from some coastal metropolis. A woman who believed that a high price tag conferred absolute ownership, not just of her own lot, but of the entire viewscape. She saw the lake not as a shared, delicate ecosystem under private ownership, but as an unregulated amenity that needed to be brought under her firm, controlling hand. Her reign began with a series of increasingly absurd new bylaws, each one a subtle encroachment on my rights and the established traditions of the lake. First came the dock standardization rule. All docks on the lake, she decreed, had to be rebuilt using a specific, hideously expensive brand of composite decking in an approved shade of lakefront taupe. My dock, a beautiful, sturdy structure of weathered wood that my father and I had built, was suddenly a violation. I had, of course, ignored it. Then came the aquatic recreation schedule. Non-motorized craft like kayaks and canoes were only permitted on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Motorized boats were allowed on weekends, but only between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., and they were not to create a wake that was, in the board's subjective opinion, excessive or disruptive to the community's tranquility. I had, of course, ignored that as well. My lawyer had sent the HOA a polite but firm letter at the very beginning of Meredith's reign. It included a certified copy of my deed and kindly reminded them that while I was happy to continue the long-standing tradition of permissive, recreational access for the residents, the lake itself was my private property and not subject to their bylaws in any way, shape, or form. The letter had been met with a stunning act of legal denial. Meredith, backed by the HOA's aggressive city-based law firm, responded by claiming that the community's continuous use of the lake for 20 years had established a prescriptive easement, effectively giving them co-ownership of the water and the right to regulate it. It was a legally baseless argument, our explicit, long-standing policy of giving permission completely invalidated any claim of hostile or adverse possession, but it was the banner under which she was now waging her increasingly hostile war, which brought us to Bylaw 117, the Angling and Wildlife Management Act. Convinced of her newfound and entirely imaginary authority, Meredith had decided that fishing was an unsightly and primitive activity. The new rule banned all fishing on the lake to preserve the aesthetic tranquility and protect the aquatic ecosystem from unnecessary harm. And I, sitting on my own dock, on my own land, catching my own dinner from my own lake, was the first official violator. This cease desist order was her checkmate. She believed she had me cornered, that I would be forced into a long, expensive legal battle to prove what was already a documented, indisputable fact. She believed that the sheer weight of her manufactured authority, her binder full of nonsensical rules, could overwhelm the simple, quiet truth of my ownership. I looked out across the water. I saw residents on their gleaming pontoon boats there, children swimming off the community beach that was, in fact, the sandiest part of my shoreline. I saw their expensive kayaks gliding across the surface. They were all enjoying a privilege, a courtesy granted by my family for decades, a privilege they now believed was an inalienable right. And their leader, their queen, had just tried to use that privilege as a weapon to banish me from my own kingdom. I folded the letter, a cold, hard resolve settling in my gut. Meredith Vance wanted to play a game of paper rules and legal fictions. She wanted to legislate my lake. Fine, I would respond in kind. But my response wouldn't be a new bylaw. It would be a simple, legally binding notice, drafted by my lawyer and delivered to every single resident of Asteria Lakes. It would inform them that the era of goodwill, the decades of permissive use, had been terminated by the hostile actions of their own leadership. The lake, as of tomorrow morning, was closed. The reaction to the notices was, to put it mildly, volcanic. My lawyer, a man who savored the precise application of legal pressure, had them delivered by a professional courier service the next morning. Single, polite, but legally ironclad. Page was taped to the heavy, ornate front door of every one of the 200 homes in the Asteria Lakes community. The notice was a masterpiece of calm, factual finality. It stated that as the sole legal owner of Parcel A, the body of water, known as Lake Asteria, I was hereby revoking the long-standing policy of permissive recreational access, effective immediately. It cited the recent hostile legal actions of the HOA, including their baseless claim of a prescriptive easement and their attempt to enforce their bylaws on my private property. As the direct cause for this revocation, it informed the residents, in unambiguous terms, that any use of the lake's surface or its 50-foot shoreline, including but not limited to swimming, boating, kayaking, or docking, would now be considered an act of criminal trespass and would be prosecuted accordingly. The document was accompanied by a clear, easy-toured copy of the official county plat map. With my property, the entire lake, and the 50-foot ribbon of land around it highlighted in a stark, unavoidable yellow dot by noon, my phone was ringing off the hook with blocked numbers, which I ignored. A small, angry mob, led by a furious Meredith Vance, had gathered at the edge of my property, shouting and waving copies of the notice like pitchforks. They couldn't come onto my land, but they could glower at me from the edge of their own perfectly manicured lawns, their faces a mixture of rage and disbelief. The centerpiece of their outrage was the new community boat dock, a massive structure they had built last year, A structure that was, as my notice had gently reminded them, an illegal encroachment on my property, a fact that was already the subject of a separate, ongoing lawsuit that they had been ignoring. At precisely 2 p.m., as I had anticipated, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up to my driveway. Meredith, seeing the arrival of the law, strode confidently to meet the deputy, a triumphant look on her face. She had clearly called them, convinced that they were here to arrest me for my illegal and monopolistic closure of the lake, an act of sheer selfish evil in her eyes. The deputy who stepped out was a seasoned officer named Clark, K., a man who understood that the most expensive houses often produced the most ridiculous disputes. He listened patiently as Meredith launched into a breathless tirade, accusing me of blackmail, of holding the community hostage, of illegally denying them access to their lake, a public trust. When she was finally finished, Deputy Clark turned and walked over to me. I was sitting on my porch, a cup of coffee in my hand, waiting calmly. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his voice professional and calm, "I've received a complaint that you are illegally blocking access to Lake Asteria. Ms. Vance here claims the lake is a community asset, that you have no right to close it off." "Good afternoon, Deputy," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Ms. Vance is mistaken, and she knows she is. The lake is private property. I am the sole owner, and I have every right to control who uses it." "He's lying," Meredith shrieked from 20 feet away, her voice cracking. "We have rights, a prescriptive easement. We've been using this lake for 20 years. That's a civil matter for a judge to decide, ma'am." The deputy called back to her without turning around, his voice laced with annoyance. He then lowered his voice and spoke to me. "Look, Mr. Grayson, I can see this is a complicated issue. What I need to know right now is whether you have the documentation to back up your claim of sole ownership." "I do," I said. I handed him a thick, waterproof folder I had prepared. Inside was everything. The certified deed for Parcel A, the original 1888 land grant, the 1994 sales document for the surrounding land that explicitly excluded the lake from the sale, and the new high-resolution survey map from my ongoing lawsuit. Against them, he took the folder and spent the next 10 minutes leaning against the hood of his cruiser, reading with a practiced, methodical eye. The angry mob of residents watched in silence, their confidence beginning to visibly waver. Meredith stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. Finally, Deputy Clark folded the last document and placed it back in the folder. He walked back over to me and handed it back, a new look of respect in his eyes. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice now holding a note of finality, "your paperwork is in order. As far as the law is concerned, you are the sole and undisputed owner of this body of water. You have every right to restrict access to it." He then turned to face Meredith and the assembled residents. He raised his voice so everyone could hear, his words echoing in the sudden, tense silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I have reviewed the official recorded county records. This lake, its bed, and its 50-foot shoreline are the private property of Mr. Thomas Grayson. The notice he has issued is a lawful exercise of his property rights. Let me be perfectly clear. Any resident of Asteria Lakes found on the water or on the shoreline from this point forward will be subject to citation, and if necessary, arrest for criminal trespass." The silence that followed was stunning. The collective gasp of 24 wealthy homeowners, realizing that their most valuable amenity, the very foundation of their property values, had just vanished, was a sound to behold. Their anger instantly began to pivot from me to the woman who had led them to this disastrous end. Meredith's face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending fury. "This is insane. You can't let him do this. We will sue. We'll bury him in legal fees." "That is certainly your right, ma'am," the deputy said, his patience clearly at an end. "But I would advise you to have your lawyers read your own sales deeds first. My understanding is that your properties were all sold as lake view, not lakefront. There is a significant legal distinction. Now, I consider this matter closed. Please disperse and return to your homes." Defeated and humiliated, the crowd slowly began to break up, casting hateful glares, not at me, but at Meredith. She was the last to leave, her face a thundercloud. Of impotent rage, the next few days were quiet. The lake, for the first time in years, was empty. No boats scarred its surface. No swimmers splashed in its shallows. It was returned to its natural state, a quiet, beautiful expanse of water, home only to the fish, the turtles, and the herons that stalked its edges. A week later, I received a letter. It was not from a lawyer. It was from a newly formed lake. Access Negotiation Committee of the Asteria Lakes HOA, Meredith Vance. I learned from a friendly neighbor, had been unceremoniously ousted as president in a furious marathon emergency meeting. The new committee, in a tone that was humble, deeply apologetic, and bordering on desperate, wished to discuss the possibility of establishing a formal, paid access agreement for the residents. They were no longer demanding their rights. Were politely and humbly asking to lease a privilege. I sat on my dock, the letter in my hand. I watched a largemouth bass break the surface of the water, its scales flashing in the afternoon sun. I smiled. The negotiations, I decided, would be long, and they would begin with a formal, written apology, forever trying to ban a man from fishing on his own lake.